Today I wanted to talk about two important topics. The first one is the calls for an inquiry into the Reserve Bank by both the OECD and the IMF. And secondly, I wanted to talk about the Australian property market. Now, the main reason why these two global organisations are advocating this inquiry into the Reserve Bank appears to me to be because the Reserve Bank has not achieved its inflation target since 2014. However, in my opinion, the main reason for that is an inappropriate target. That target of 2 to 3% on average over the cycle was first established informally in October 1992 and then formally in 1996. But in 1992, the Australian cash rate was 5.75% and the bond rate was 6.5%. And that gave the Reserve Bank great flexibility to achieve its target. We're also coming off a period where over the last 7 years, inflation had averaged more than 8%. You also have to remember that other central banks have a different target. The US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank all have a target of around 2%. The Bank of Canada and the Bank of New Zealand have a target of 1 to 3%. So those 5 major central banks are all targeting a 2% inflation rate, whereas in the case of Australia, we're targeting 2.5%. Yesterday we saw confirmation once again from the Reserve Bank Governor, following the October board meeting, that the board does not expect to achieve their inflation target and to start raising interest rates until 2024. So just imagine that, 4 years of the Australian cash rate at 0.1%, effectively zero. Now, ironically, we don't believe that is how things will turn out. We're expecting in 2022 a very sharp lift in demand, with the economy growing by 7.5%, impacted by supply shocks, both to the labour market and to the goods market, and the combination of those two factors will see the Reserve Bank achieve its inflation target by the end of 2022, and we'll see the first rate hike by the first quarter of 2023. But this is an unusual period. And in future cycles, I believe that 2.5% target will prove to be the problem that it's been since 2014. So what might happen? Well, the precedent is that target is reviewed after elections or after when a new governor is appointed. And sometimes the agreement is renewed in the statement of the conduct of monetary policy after the election. And it's possible that at that time, the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank Governor could agree to lower the target to 1 to 3%. Now, under the Reserve Bank's current forecast, I don't believe they really expect to get to that 2.5% until the second half of 2024, whereas the 2% is likely to be reached by the middle of 2023. But what if we are wrong? And what if the Reserve Bank's forecasts are right? So we do have this 4-year period where interest rates are at 0.1%. Well, what will happen? As we saw announced this morning, the regulator will start imposing direct controls. So this morning we saw a lift in the loan serviceability buffer from 2.5% to 3%. That's the rate that banks need to stress their borrowers to make sure that if rates were to rise by 2.5%, now 3%, that the borrower could still service the loan. But direct controls are always things that can generate instability. For instance, direct controls can push activity away from the regulated sector to the unregulated sector, which is often the sector that is less capitalised and is in less of a position to deal with any major economic shocks. And direct regulations, people can always find ways around them. So they favour those that are able to invest in strategies to get around those regulations. Now, the two previous periods when we've had these macroprudential controls have been 2015 and 2017. And in both of those occasions, the controls were largely directed at investors. In 2015, the rate of growth of loans to investors. 2017, the growth in interest-only loans, which are favoured by investors. But in this cycle, investors aren't playing that prominent role yet. New lending to investors is only up by 30% of total new lending, whereas in those previous cycles, in those previous periods, it was 40 to 45%. For investors as well, it's very attractive that they can lock in term funding costs below rental yields. And of course, the uncertainty that we're starting to see around the equity market associated with the large supply shocks in China and the nervousness that we detect every day in the US market might also push new investors into that housing market. So in my view, in the last 12 months with these zero interest rates, we've seen property prices up by more than 20%, the fastest annual growth rate we've seen since 2002. And with those rates being signalled to be there for a number of years, I think that even with these direct controls, we're going to see further upward pressure on prices. So think about the trade-off. The trade-off is really a central bank that's insisting on achieving 2.5% inflation, that in their own thinking is going to mean 4 years of almost zero rates, or adopting a target that is equal to where other central banks are at 2%, and in their forecasts, they'd be expecting to reach that around the middle of 2023. Trade that off against 4 years of zero rates and the impact that'll have on distortions in the market through the long periods of direct controls and potentially overshooting in prices, that when we do reach the point where rates have to rise, there could be a lot of disruption to the Australian economy. So my plea is to both the Treasurer and the Governor to review that target. Let's not have a long, expensive inquiry into our most highly regarded institution globally and the epitome of best practice domestically. We don't need that. We just need a review of that target, which could avoid a long period of direct controls and a long period thereafter where overpriced markets may create real pain for the Australian economy. Thank you.